Hey, just popping in right at the beginning of this video before we get into the meat of it. If you have not heard already somehow, DAW is doing a deluxe hardcover version of Empire of Silence that you can pre-order right now. It's going to be coming out at the same time as the hardcover of Shadows Upon Time, and this particular deluxe edition is special, not just because it's got a little gold foil, the lettering is a different color, it's got sprayed edges, that's all fine and dandy. The thing that makes this edition really cool is that it's an official, more accessible version of Empire of Silence with the updated text. So if you were not able to get in on the Diamond Edition or the Andorida Special Edition for Empire of Silence, this is your chance to get a copy of the book with the updated text. There has been no word yet on whether the ebook would be updated or anything like that, but there is now going to be a traditionally published copy of the book with the updated text. So if that's something you're interested in getting your hands on, I highly recommend going to pre-order that anywhere where you can pre-order books. And as one final note on that topic, the deluxe edition was originally announced as having been an all-signed edition. It turns out that's not the plan of what's going on anymore. If you go to any particular site where there's an offering of signed edition versus unsigned edition, you can get either or. Presumably the signed edition is only while supplies last. That's just my assumption. I don't know that for sure, but that's my guess. So definitely check on that when you go to make your order. That's it for now. Let's just actually get into my re-review of Empire of Silence. Empire of Silence has been, and likely always will be, the weakest book in the Sun Eater. But that doesn't mean that I haven't underrated it to some degree in my own way. You see, when I first read the book in August 2022, I was thoroughly impressed by this debut, for exactly that reason. For a debut, Empire of Silence is an incredible book. I'm not much for half-star ratings with books on account of Goodreads' archaic technology that somehow doesn't allow for them, but I at the time considered the book to be a 4.5-star outing, which I ultimately rounded up because of how impressed I was that it was a debut. A fundamentally solid book deserves a fundamentally solid rating, and while 4 stars would and should suffice in such a circumstance, I was willing to give it the edge on account of the context. But that 5-star rating wasn't meant to last, for in September 2022 I read Howling Dark. That sequel was so damn impressive to me that I had to knock the first book's 5-star roundup back to a rounded down 4. I didn't even really have to think about the decision either. It made sense to me. I liked Empire of Silence a good bit, but it was nowhere near the caliber of Howling Dark. And that's where that ended. Every book in the Sun Eater was 5 stars after that, leaving the debut in the unfortunate position of easily the weakest book in the series. But after reading Ashes of Man, book 5 in the series in February 2023, the Diamond Edition Kickstarter for the first book was just a few months away. When that Kickstarter happened, I decided to reread the book on a whim. A strange whim that honestly complicated no small number of things over the following year or two. But after the first reread, I would say my experience with the novel didn't actually change that much. Namely, I still rated it 4 stars as opposed to 5, and I still had my issues with certain parts of the structural pacing. I mean, the foreshadowing I noticed, having read, as I said, through the 5th book, the latest entry at that point in time, was really cool, but not enough to change the core of my opinion. It's been a couple years now since I did that reread, and I reread it again this spring, just ahead of getting early access to the series finale, Shadows Upon Time. This recent reread was done with the updated special edition text, and somehow, that made all the difference. While I still believe this book is the weakest entry in the Sun Eater, I was wrong about one thing before. Empire of Silence is actually a masterpiece. So what exactly do I mean by masterpiece? Well, there are plenty of variable, albeit similar, ways to use the term, and what that means to one person might not fully line up with another. For me, A masterpiece is merely a true work of art that manages to stand apart from contemporaries for one reason or another, whatever that may be. It also indicates a body of work seen through by a cohesive vision that culminates in a whole greater than the sum of its parts. In this way, masterpieces don't have to be quote unquote perfect, especially considering how subjectively that term is often thrown around by the likes of reviewers not horribly unlike me. So, in that sense, I am not arguing that Empire of Silence is perfect. I yet believe that it is the weakest of the series, as I've already said a handful of times, but I neither believe it needs to be perfect to be considered the masterpiece it is. But what makes Empire of Silence a masterpiece after all? To understand, we must first understand at least one of the major inspirations of the book and series as a whole, and so what has come to define the journey the main character and narrator takes us on. Christopher Rocchio is a big fan of Dune by Frank Herbert. Speaking for myself, I think the best part of that seminal piece of science fiction is defined by the heroic journey, messianic even, which Paul Atreides takes in that book. The problem is that Frank misunderstands what he did in his own novel, and so chose to heavily course correct in the short sequel to do and therefore state rather explicitly what he had originally intended with the first book, that charismatic leaders are dangerous and outright bad. We will ignore for now the fact that the fourth book of the Dune series course corrects again to showcase why Paul was necessary for the good of humanity despite the atrocities. Let's just say Frank was very confused about his own damn thesis, to say the least. Either way, Empire of Silence wears its Dune influence on its sleeve, with certain aspects of world building and important scenes being reminiscent of some iconic moments from its forebear. On the surface, this has led some readers to call the introduction of the Sun Eater a cheap ripoff, which is completely disingenuous in my opinion, and obviously so if you read beyond the first handful of chapters. But it also brilliantly lays the foundation for what the series has implicitly come to do over the years. Sun Eater is not a ripoff of Dune, but rather in active conversation with it, in particular about its very thesis, where Herbert attempts to convey the point that messianic leaders are bad despite showcasing in his first book the exact opposite. Sun Eater instead seeks to say something a bit more nuanced. A charismatic, natural, and messianic figure as a leader can and is a good thing in bringing about the salvation of humanity, whether said humanity accepts or realizes it or not. It is a story of good intentions where Hadrian Marlowe seeks to settle the feud between mankind and the Cielsen in one manner, but ends up having to do so in another way. He is adored by some and hated by others. But before the ultimate end of the series and the execution of the thesis of Christopher's work, Hadrian Marlowe is a boy who has to grow up. Empire of Silence is merely the first half of the first act of the series, and explores the characterization of its narrator to a far deeper degree than any of Frank's work ever could with Paul. To be fair, that wasn't necessarily what Herbert was doing, but it's still a valid point. To me, this is the central pillar on which this book stands. To be honest, there's not a ton of active plot progression in Empire of Silence. This is a large part of why it is weaker than the rest. But what I didn't give it fully fair credit for before was the amount of focus it puts on Hadrian himself and to the dichotomy of the man at that, narrator versus boy. Not everybody is a fan of Hadrian, especially not the younger version of him depicted in this book, and Howling Dark as well. I get that, but for me, I somehow connected to certain aspects of him closer than I do to many protagonists. That says a lot, mind you, since I as a reader often become the main character or characters of any book I read, whether I'm like them in actuality or not. There are exceptions to this, but generally I take on roles of characters in my head as if I'm acting them out in an adaptation in my head. Hadrian was one that stuck with me from the very beginning in Delos. My connection to that character has obviously only deepened as time has gone on and as I've read more of The Sun Eater. Like I mentioned earlier, I had already reread Empire of Silence not too long after I had read Ashes of Man, and that deepened my connection to Hadrian even further, significantly further than my first go-around. The first time I read Sun Eater, I thoroughly connected to and was invested in Hadrian, the on-page character, the character of recounting and memory. That was one thing alone. But my second time, I related far more to the Hadrian of narration, the much older man doing the recounting. Seeing and understanding his criticisms of his past self, calling out the naivety of the younger man, which I had completely ignored and glossed over the first time around, it made the experience much more poignant, impactful, and meaningful in a macro sense compared to the mere micro of my first read. But this third time going through the story, I found myself in the shoes of both Hadrians, unlike either previous read. This combined with the additional story to be found in Disquiet Gods, the 6th book of the series, which further changes the scope of the universe beyond anything in the prior books, and also tied with the edits and adjustments made to the special edition text of the book, made for what felt fundamentally like a new experience. I felt this time as if I was not merely rereading a book that I enjoyed. I felt too like I was the man burned, as Hadrian has been, fully reliving the memories of my own past, memories which stung worse than the wounds first felt 3 years ago. There are plenty of things that occur in Empire of Silence that took on an entirely new meaning this go-around that they couldn't even in my prior reread. Certain character interactions felt more visceral and poignant than I ever could have imagined. I was saddened by Gibson and Kat, intimidated by Alistair and Gilliam, sympathetic of Switch and Anais, bonded with Palino and Ciron, and in wonder of the Umonda and the Cielcin all in turn, and to greater effect than I was before, not to mention all of the other characters. I felt my emotions rocked and affected more tangibly with this year's reading than in readings of years past. Perhaps a portion of this can be blamed on the sheer level of stress and just tired I was this spring, but I suspect it wasn't just that. At least part of it was the Diamond Edition's take on the text. Now, to clarify, the edits made from the original text to the updated text aren't the most substantial things in the world. Somebody not deeply familiar with the book, or not reading the texts essentially side by side, is unlikely to notice the majority of changes, if any of them. So why did the Diamond Edition wow me so much? Well, probably because I did read the texts side by side. That's half the reason it took me like 2 months to get through. It was a long, but supremely worth it experience. Many of the edits are relatively insubstantial, but they do bring Hadrian's mannerisms in the text to be somewhat more akin to more recent books in the series. In nearly every case, this was a net benefit on the tone of the story. Furthermore, certain inconsistencies were fixed, notably a line mentioned Hadrian's self-proclaimed agnosticism in the original, amongst others. In totality, the grand total of the changes isn't the biggest, but it's enough to substantially improve how I feel about it for some reason. Maybe it was the act of comparison that did it, and I'm sure that's true, but the best moment of my reread by far was the chapter entitled I Dare Not Meet in Dreams. If you know the moment, it is the moment of Caliga, you know what scene I'm talking about. That scene is cool enough in the original, but the special edition expansions are unbelievably cool. They're so much more clear and reflect upon later moments in the series so substantially it was like reading an entirely new chapter. This was the moment that, having read through Disquiet Gods now instead of just through Ashes of Man, really made all the difference for me. It is that good of a scene. It's not quite up there with chapter 43 of Howling Dark, but it certainly has a lot going for it. One of the weakest aspects of Empire of Silence in my memory has always been the pacing, as I believe I mentioned earlier. This is largely because the plot is split up a little more strangely than one might expect, and also because of how much more the day-in-the-life detail is included. First, the latter point. Hadrian's story is long, sufficiently long. I believe the full series, not including non-Hadrian side material, is somewhere in the 2 million word range. Including non-Hadrian side material, you can expect to read probably somewhere pretty close to 2.5 million words all told. This means it isn't horribly far off from half the length of Wheel of Time in the one case and more than half the length in the other. But Christopher almost always utilizes that word count a million times more efficiently than Robert Jordan ever could, except maybe in New Spring or possibly The Dragon Reborn at best. This isn't necessarily a dig at Robert Jordan, but even his biggest fans know and acknowledge quite rightly that he is not always the most efficient writer. Christopher Ruocchio is an efficient writer, however, and he is at his most efficient in the last two entries of The Sun Eater, Disquiet Gods and Shadows Upon Time. But Christopher wasn't always so efficient. In books 6 through 7, a large part of the efficiency is due to substantial amounts of words being cut with the aid of his editor, Dave Butler, who wrote Witchy, and which you should absolutely read if you like alternate history and or epic fantasy. In books 4 through 5, the efficiency was Christopher coming into his own with the prose style he had developed with the first 3 books. In books 2 to 3, the prose was already pretty good. But in this, the first book, the plot moves slower than the rest, and the prose follows suit. Hadrian is arguably at his most outright philosophical in Empire of Silence, or at least the most directly so. The narrator is, anyway. As he begins his tale, it's easy to imagine him agonizing over very many details to plot and character and description in ways that he slowly came to shirk over the course of writing his own history, realizing that maybe that breadth of detail isn't entirely necessary. That said, from a meta perspective, it helps us to really come to understand Hadrian's early life and the world he inhabits, and therefore who he is. I can easily forgive Christopher the relatively long wind in covering Delos and especially Imesh in this book. I do so because it was his first novel, firstly, but also because he managed to find a compelling balance of the narrator and the memory in the book that isn't exactly pursued in the same way afterwards. But now we return to the point about the plot being split up a bit strangely. While the prose is slightly less efficient than later entries, something made a tad bit better in particular moments of the special edition text, what strikes me now is how the acts or story arcs of the book are organized. Most of the books of the series feel pretty solidly like they have 3 acts, even if some of those acts feature multiple story arcs within them. Empire of Silence is the worst paced book in The Sun Eater because it does not have 3 acts, nor does it have 5. It has 4, and that is exceedingly strange. Delos is the first act, the Street Urchin and Myrmidon arcs make up the second act, the House Mataro arc makes up the third act, and the Caliga arc makes up the fourth act. This, to me, is what sets this novel apart. Each of these acts is a near identical quarter of the book, and occasionally some of the scenes to be found here feel somewhat superfluous to the overall narrative. But the living, breathing world which Hadrian inhabits is one that I inhabited more deeply on this third read than I did the first 2 times, and something about that contrast made the book click in my mind in a way it hadn't before. Part of me also reflects upon my recent reread of Empire of Silence not on account of what the book itself offered me this time around. Part of what shaped my experience coming out of it at the end of May was actually reading Shadows Upon Time for the first time immediately afterwards. The day after I finished Empire of Silence, Christopher sent me the draft of Shadows Upon Time to start. By the way, I do have a review of that book from a couple weeks back on this very platform that you can check out if you are so inclined. It was a wonderful experience to read that early, and ironically perfectly timed. The final entry of Sun Eater calls back to the debut in so many ways that seem subtle, that made both experiences inherently better given the timing of reading them. That I Dare Not Meet in Dreams chapter I mentioned earlier, that gets called back to specifically a number of times, and it was quite awesome. Ultimately, I think I've done a hell of a poor job expressing just why I have suddenly come to think of Empire of Silence as a masterpiece trademark, where I didn't necessarily feel that way before. Was it the subtle depth of the edits of the special edition? Was it the way I related to it more after having experienced Disquiet Gods, and retroactively so with Shadows Upon Time 2? Was it just my emotional condition being relatively down in the dumps, opening me up to more inherent connection than either of the first two times? Now, in the end, I don't fully know what specifically changed, but something did, that much I can't deny, and even if I don't understand it, like I hoped I would after over a month of sitting on this review waiting to write it. It could just be all the little things adding together to make my third reading of this book so much more special. In either case, I have now, after nearly 3 years, come to return Empire of Silence to the 5-star rating it deserves. I was right to give it that before, the first time. I just didn't truly know it yet. Thank you so much for watching this video. This is my second review technically of Empire of Silence. My first one was a few years back when I had first read the book and was a significantly different type of video than this one was. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that if you have not already, that you come to watch the Shadows Upon Time review that I did a couple of weeks ago in much a similar format as this. To close out this video here, I just want to re-mention the fact that that Shadows Upon Time video also announces a giveaway that I have going on for some Sun Eater stuff. So if you are interested in that, I have included that same Google form for the giveaway in the description of this video, but be warned that that giveaway is only being run for a couple of more days. August 1st at noon Mountain Time, I will be closing the valid entries for that giveaway. So if you have not seen it and have not entered yet, I highly encourage that you do so in the next couple of days before the entries close. And hey, just popping in one more time here before we close off. Thank you so much for watching the video. If you did, just wanted to remind you one last time that you can pick up a deluxe hardcover edition of Empire of Silence from any of the places where you normally get your books. Just go ahead and pre-order it right now. That'll come at the same time as your Shadows Upon Time copy. They're going to be published on the same day, so I highly recommend doing that if you have not read the updated text or have not otherwise been able to get your hands on an edition with the updated text. If you have any feedback for this review, or if you want to let me know your thoughts on Empire of Silence, I encourage you to do that in the comment section down below. Thank you one final time for watching. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.